Hello, and thanks for joining us as we present our second of two webinars addressing clinical variation reduction, a readiness strategy to drive value, sponsored by Clinical Intelligence. I'm Sandy Owen, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar as Laurie Jaccard and Dr. Doug Monroe recap the key points from webinar one, addressing the readiness phase, and move right into the activation and sustainability phases. Laurie Jaccard founded Clinical Intelligence, or CI, in 2001. CI serves as a national market leader in transforming and optimizing clinical performance for hospitals and care delivery networks to create sustainable value through applied analytics, advanced care management, service line optimization, and clinical variation reduction initiatives. Dr. Doug Monroe has over 20 years of healthcare experience, including strategy and strategic planning, physician engagement, clinical integration, accountable care, high reliability, clinical operations, and large integrated consulting engagements. And with that, I'll turn it over to Laurie now to get us started.
Thank you, Sandy, so much. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be recapping our webinar one, which was focused on the readiness of clinical variation. And we'll really focus on the key staples around clinician and physician engagement. And Dr. Doug Monroe will be facilitating, and we are so excited to present to you the clinical variation readiness, activation, and sustain. It's so important. We'll be talking about the clinical variation, clinical consensus teams, developing evidence-based work plans. We'll be sharing data and examples of ClinView and clinical intelligence analytics, so we can help you how to create data and meaningful data and actionable data. And we really will focus on helping you get started wherever you are in your journey. So some recap from our clinical variation readiness and pre-activation webinar is we all recognize this is an opportunity. Clinical variation reduction can really drive sustainable outcomes, clinical, quality, operational, and financial outcomes. But it really begins with a vision, a plan, engagement, leadership, physician engagement, research, a lot of components in clinical variation studies. So we hope to unpack this for you so it leaves behind for you a true and tried methodology for clinical variation. So we'll get started and we'll think about, just individually think about your clinical variation program for your entity, whether you're a system, an ACO, inpatient, outpatient. Clinical variation, what level of confidence do you have in your overall ability to activate your initiative for your organization? Are you confident? You have some confidence, high confidence? It's okay. There are so many different phases. Everybody's thinking about clinical variation. We're all in different phases, and trust me, it's really an art, and along with the science. So it is a performance improvement process. It's a systematic approach, and typically there are three phases, key phases: the readiness phase, the activation phase, where we're implementing evidence-based processes, we form the teams, we have all the governance in place, and then the monitoring phase. That's the ongoing monitoring to realize the impact of the clinical variation initiatives. Clinical Intelligence has developed a roadmap for change to accelerate the clinical variation process. This is really a compilation of integrating different performance improvement systems and also applying our expertise in the field with what are the key steps for clinical variation. So we believe it's a journey, it's a performance improvement process that is a cycle. The cycle can be repeated over and over, but it begins with crystallizing the opportunity. What is it that we want to improve upon? Quality, cost, margin. And we begin with defining the opportunity, defining the vision for the organization, the strategy, the plan. How will we report up the clinical variation strategies and efforts and work plans and results? And and who will be our leaders, our sponsors, who will help us with project management, how will we measure our data and analyze whether we're making an improvement or not. So it really does begin with a lot of planning. Then the next layer is really the implementation, the activation, where it begins with a charter. How do we frame that project? How do we define it? What are our goals? Who will be helping us on our teams? And what will be their individual roles and responsibilities? And how much time will this take? So you can kind of relate to this performance improvement process. Very familiar. We'll analyze data. We'll talk about how we design the work plans and process maps and how we implement those changes. And then the final stage is a sustain phase. It's really where we realize results, we report those results back to all the key stakeholders, and we control the process. The clinical variation, as we define, is the overutilization of resources, whether it be human resources or resources around supplies or lab or pharmacy. It's all about reducing the unnecessary or unwarranted variation. We all know that there is a lot of variation in patient care just by the nature of the clinical aspects of the patient. Every patient is different, and so there will be always opportunities to reduce the variation and unwarranted. We really will focus on these three stages, and every stage has the data that will drive this phase. From the readiness phase, identifying and quantifying the benefit opportunity. How much opportunity is there in your organization to reduce variation? And then throughout the implementation, what type of data will you share back to your key stakeholders? What data, what format, what are the key performance indicators? What does that look like? So we'll share all those details with you. And then finally, we'll share some examples of some dashboards and scorecards and storyboards to help really focus on your efforts of reducing that variation. This is just a screenshot of years ago when I was working with a hospital in the Midwest. This hospital really was committed to quality and evidence-based medicine. So in 1 year, we developed 35 evidence-based protocols. This was really exciting. At the time, I think it was back in the 90s, the medical staff, some of them were very reluctant to implement evidence-based medicine because they thought maybe it was cookbook medicine, and every physician and provider would really be limited or constricted in this. But it turned out that this hospital became a top 100 hospital within about a year after we implemented the program. What we saw was so exciting. We began to study the current state. We implemented clinical guidelines. You can see this is an example of an algorithm for cath and PTCA and stent. And we associated the data, process and outcomes data, and we actually built all these protocols, and the medical executive committee approved them. We built an intranet site so the physicians could access these and print these. And what was great is we even linked the protocols and algorithms to the scientific evidence. We annotated these. So this was tremendously successful. It was all integrated. So when you think about hardwiring change, this is one way to really boost your clinical variation program, is to take a look at your current evidence-based orders. Are they opinion-based orders? Are they personalized order sets? Or are they truly evidence-based medicine order sets that physicians approve and actually commit to utilizing? So with the beginning of the program, we always look at these key staples. These are the essentials. We need leadership. We need leadership alignment, and this is important to leadership. Leadership has expressed this. Leadership truly believes that driving variation is a way to improve quality and decrease cost. We need the resources, we need the people, we need the people's time and commitment, and we need tools, we need data, and we need people to understand how to use the data and analytics. And so there's training involved. And most importantly is the provider engagement. We just cannot implement an evidence-based clinical variation program without the physician leadership, the championship, the commitment, and Dr. Doug Monroe will be really focusing in on that. So it begins with that vision, that charter, that governance. Where will we report these clinical variation projects? Where will we provide updates? So form a governance structure. You can look at your own governance structure and determine where this will live. Do you want this to live in your utilization management committee? Would you like this to be a subcommittee of your MEC, your pharmacy and therapeutics committee, your quality committee? There's a lot of choices. There's nothing, no wrong, no right, as long as you have that physician leadership and administrative leadership. So when you think about your clinical variation program, and this is an advanced care management strategy. So if you have a weak care management infrastructure in place, and you layer the clinical variation program, it may not have its greatest success. So take a look at your care management foundation. Do you have a good model? Do you have the medical staff leadership integrated in that care management? Are you coordinating patient care? Do you have multidisciplinary rounds in place? Are you really focused on care coordination to drive quality? So having a strong care management foundation will really help boost that clinical variation effort. The right fit analytics are a key staple for a successful clinical variation program, because you have to be able to have a process of how do you objectively measure clinical variation? How do you translate that variation into the opportunity? There are many ways you can do that, but one way CI takes a look at defining clinical variation is through 3 different methods. You can measure the variation above the mean, and measure that, what would be your impact if you could reduce the provider outcomes to the mean. What would be that impact? So kind of taking those providers towards the mean. The second methodology you may consider is there might be a combined methodology. You might want to reduce above the mean, and then you might also want to reduce those that are below the mean a certain percentage. So you can kind of have a hybrid. And the third is that you're just going to reduce all variation. And you might be looking at variation in a lot of ways. You might be looking at cost, mortality, readmissions, clinical documentation. There's just so many ways you can study clinical variation. It really relates to a lot of indicators. Here we're looking at direct cost per case. How do we move the provider's direct cost per case for knee replacement, where there's wide variation in the low volume physicians? How do we move that to the left? We talked about the importance of hardwiring change, and one of the strategies to consider is through evidence-based medicine, using your protocols and clinical guidelines to impact the change. Also, this can be accomplished by creating what we call process maps, looking at your current process and workflow and bringing your teams together to improve the efficiency of that workflow. So there are a number of ways you can reduce the variation, the variability in the practice patterns around care, and embed that evidence base into that process. So the key, again, is that we empower the providers to create a culture of accountable care through evidence-based medicine. And so at this time, I'm pleased to transition this over to Dr. Doug Monroe to focus on the clinical variation activation phase.
Well, thanks so much, Laurie, and thanks for inviting me to be here today. part of activating clinical variation reduction is leveraging the clinical expertise you currently have in your organization. Typically, physicians and other clinicians are the most expensive resource you have in your hospital, and they also have the greatest expertise in providing clinical care. And so leveraging their expertise to reduce clinical variation is extremely important. So how do we identify clinical engagement? And I think the easiest place to start is knowing that you need to include physicians and other clinicians in planning from the very start. Including them there ensures that there is alignment from the very beginning of an initiative all the way through the end. It also allows opportunities to work with the team, and working with people, if it's successful, builds trust. And in many organizations, it's necessary to build trust with the clinicians and physicians before embarking on initiatives. As we mentioned before, leveraging the clinical expertise in the planning process is extremely important, not only to your outcomes, but to the feelings the physicians and other clinicians have about participating. Something to avoid is having the clinicians and physicians feel like what you're presenting to them is fait accompli, or that they have no input into your plans or to the initiative. And that is something that can be very destructive to a care variation reduction initiative. So what are the benefits of physician engagement? There are a number, as you probably already know, but what we're targeting are better outcomes, safer care, lower cost, and timelier provision of care. And those are all very process and clinical operations oriented benefits. But if you have tension with your physicians in your organization right now, or opportunities to improve your relationships with physicians, embarking upon the journey of physician and clinician engagement can increase collaboration and enhance the relationships you have with your physicians. Many times, medical staffs have a relationship with executive leadership at a hospital or healthcare system that is adversarial. And through this process, we'd like to teach both parties to be more transactional than adversarial, asking or saying to someone who presents them with an opportunity to improve, that sounds good, and we'd also like to improve this as well. And that sharing of priorities between clinicians and administration is what leads to the best outcomes, and frankly should happen every time you embark, especially upon a clinical variation reduction initiative, and it also aligns the goals. So on the left there, you can see the things that you probably want to avoid. You want to avoid setting priorities without leveraging the clinical expertise. It leads to burnout and stress for clinicians to not be a part of the decision-making process. And frankly, it leads to increased liability for the hospital and the clinicians themselves. You want to target the things on the right: teamwork, clinical decisions that are guided by clinical expertise, and the improvement of outcomes. There is a value to saying to clinicians, I don't know what the answer is, and I need your help to discover it. And the entire time you engage with physicians and clinicians, you need to be transparent not only with your data, but with your goals and the desires of the improvement initiative in the first place. And you must ensure that when you speak with them, you're always speaking with integrity. These are very smart people. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to misguide them or fool them. And that's the last thing you want to do, because that can erode the relationship quite quickly. So when you get physicians involved, sometimes it can be a little intimidating for people, because what you're really saying is, I'm letting them make decisions. And it can be a little scary, especially if your relationship with them is adversarial. But you need to give them decision rights over clinical variation reduction and clinical processes, because they are the only ones in the hospital qualified to make those decisions and with the education to be able to make those extremely, sometimes very complex clinical operations decisions. You want them involved in all of those operational and strategic decisions you make. Major leadership changes physicians should have input into, the committees, teams, and projects that you're going through, setting the agenda for themselves. And also, it's important to reinforce their decision rights by including them in celebrations and, frankly, in any failures or challenges you encounter along the way. In exchange for those decision rights, you will ask them to accept accountability for the performance and the decisions they make. And that is extremely important to make them aware of when you're granting them decision rights. Is, doc, I will, we'd like to allow a group of you to make these decisions, but in exchange, we expect accountability for the decisions you make. So in the end, when you engage them in the process from the beginning, they will influence it. And we talked about how that's good, because clinical expertise has value. It's important to facilitate those meetings when they're making decisions in a way that is transactional, not adversarial. This is your fault. We need to move forward. Why do you keep resisting me? Becomes, we'd like to do this. What are some things that might appeal to you that we can work on as well? And they need to feel like their participation is valued. And again, always pairing decision rights with robust accountabilities and being explicit about the responsibilities physicians have as members of the team is extremely important. So some of the responsibilities the physicians will have is, one, they need to be interested in participating for the right reasons. If there is some tension between the hospital and the physicians and they're trying to work, in direct opposition to your goals, those physicians you might not want to engage early. You might want to wait until other physicians are engaged first. Usually they have, as specialists, they have some sort of interest in specific areas. And at first you can start with having them focus on their own area. And of course, later transition them to interspecialty teams where the improvements and the variation reduction flows out across specialties. They need to be able to trust the organization and trust your competency and your intentions to change. As Laurie mentioned before, physicians used to look at practice as a personal choice, as an art. These days, what we're really focusing on is consensus-driven decisions amongst the physicians, so that no one physician is saying, this is how I'm going to prevent surgical site infections, but as a group, they leverage their clinical expertise to decide how they are going to go forward together. And that sort of standardization is really what drives operational clinical variation down. They also need to understand the time commitment they're going to have and an understanding of your approach, both your improvement approach, why you're doing it, and how you intend to get there. That they need to understand as much about care variation reduction as the administrators do themselves. So which physician should you pick to participate in something like this? Initially, we usually look to the higher engaged physicians, and you can see that there on the pyramid. These are people who are PI initiators. Maybe sometimes they annoy you with all of their improvement ideas. That's a good thing, and you should begin to harvest that. People who are engaged in leadership roles, both formally and informally there. It's not just important to have the chairman of the med exec involved. There are certain physicians in your organization who influence the opinions of other physicians, and they're good people to engage initially. You have those physicians in the moderate category there, somewhere in the middle. They may have some desire to improve, but may not have the education around PI, or may have never done an improvement initiative before. These people will be willing participants, but their activity level may vary. They represent a recruitment opportunity and, frankly, an education opportunity as well. Then you have those physicians in the lower engaged category. These are the ones where you're going to have to be very careful about why they're unengaged and ascertain the reasons for their disengagement. They may lack formal duties altogether. When they provide you with feedback, it often may be reactive feedback rather than proactive feedback, or feedback that is critical without suggesting a solution. And then there are some physicians that may be recalcitrant, i.e., they are suspicious of your intentions or the hospital's intentions, and they don't want to participate. We'll talk a little bit about those physicians later, but as you can see, it's important to work down from those who are there already to those who may want to be participating in something like this, to those who really have an opportunity to improve where they are in terms of their physician engagement. So on the left there, I think this is a very important point, and I use it in my parenting skills all the time. I can't control my children. They're 7 and 12 years old, and they're smarter than me. So what I try to do is influence them. That's the key, not control, to a collaborative physician engagement approach, to realize that these people have something of value to add that perhaps the rest of the team lacks. We've talked about granting them decision rights and ensuring those priorities are a joint decision. But on the right there, you see ways in which you can really move forward with engaging the physicians, everything from including them from the beginning to training them on those PI or non-clinical skills. Sponsoring them for leadership and participation opportunities is extremely important, as is acknowledging when they make a contribution. It's a party when they succeed. And frankly, it should be. You're improving outcomes, you're making care more efficient, and you're decreasing costs. Those are all things that the hospital should be doing, second only to the provision of actual patient care itself. Involve them in decision making and ensuring that when they are involved, you're not scheduling things so they conflict with those clinical duties and the provision of patient care that is their top priority. Make sure you communicate what the expectations are for their participation. And very critical here, you have a lot of support resources who are experts in their own areas, whether they be data management, infection control, abstractors, perfusionists, anyone from throughout your system who's going to be brought to the table on these clinical consensus teams to help inform the decisions and inform the physicians needs to be positioned for success and understand your physician engagement approach as well. And then you need to provide them with a structure in which they can both make decisions and ensure those decisions are executed at the bedside. So we always get feedback from physicians about the type of data and what they want and need to make those decisions. We never present data to physicians unless it's been vetted, thoroughly vetted and validated by them itself. Hey doc, we've read these things. Here's the data we're presenting to you. Does this feel right to you? Does this match up with your experience on the floors? You need to make them and help them understand the data and how it's presented. For instance, in infection control, often NHSN definitions of infections, the definition, inclusion, and exclusion criteria may vary from their clinical understanding of what an infection is. Nevertheless, you need to record the data for NHSN one way, although they are using different criteria for infections. They need to understand those criteria for the purposes of data management and data submission in a hospital in order to be able to help you. Otherwise, the data you present to them won't feel right, even though you know it may be accurate. And just basically, you need to make sure they are on board and educated before launching the program. So the old way to engage physicians is to go to a surgeon, for instance, and say your surgical site infection data is bad and you have a problem, doc. What's wrong with you? So here's how I want you to fix it. That does not lead to constructive physician relationships, and it does not communicate to them that you value their opinions. The better way to do this, and this is a small example, is to say our SSI data is bad and we have a problem, and we'd like to provide you with some resources and a structure that can help you fix the problem together, not only including all those areas from around the hospital that may be key stakeholders in those SSIs and that data, but also your fellow physicians who may have SSI data that looks better than yours. How can we leverage their expertise? And of course, using other physicians to communicate with physicians and helping them make clinical improvement decisions and variation reduction decisions is an extremely effective technique when engaging physicians. So when we engage physicians, it's important to remember that no matter how much expertise you have in Six Sigma or Lean or data, it's important that you know what you don't know. And that's what we mean by conscious incompetence. In the top left-hand box here, you see unconscious incompetence, which is not knowing what you don't know. Always very dangerous, okay? If you don't know that you know unconscious competence, that's a good thing because you're already competent, you just don't know it yet. It's like the fourth year of medical school. You don't know, but you know a lot, but you don't know that you actually know what you're talking about. Knowing that you know conscious competence, of course, is always where you want to be, but a lot of these things are complex, and there's a team in the hospital and in healthcare systems for a reason. There is too much information for any one person to hold in their head at one time. And so knowing where your lane is, knowing where the boundaries of your expertise is incredibly important. I once dealt with a Six Sigma black belt who came to me and said, I was a quality system director of quality at that time, came to me and said, you know, you're the system director of quality, and our system is lousy with surgical site infections, and that's all your fault. Give me all of the data. I'll go back over the weekend, crunch it in my laptop, and on Monday, I'll have an answer to all of the surgical site infections. First of all, that's not possible. It's a silly thing to say, and it shows that black belt did, and by the way, black belts are fantastic resources. We use them all the time. But that particular black belt did not understand where her knowledge stopped and clinical expertise needed to be leveraged. And so knowing what you don't know is incredibly important. We need support resources who know the value of clinical expertise, physicians and other clinicians who know the value of improvement and clinical support expertise, and leaders who know how to organize and harvest all of that expertise. I think that's what's important. So it's also important to remember with physicians that performance improvement is not part of the curriculum in most medical schools, and that clinical expertise doesn't equal performance improvement expertise, and nor does PI expertise equal clinical expertise either. And so a well-defined process and improvement approach should be shared with physicians so that they understand where their expertise fits into the approach that you are taking. In terms of your operational PI approach, which approach you select is a lot less important than the fact that the physicians understand that approach and have been educated and trained in applying that approach. That's what's most important. So if we look here, if you ask a room full of physicians, and I have many times, could you explain or outline for me the scientific method? Often I don't get many answers. Maybe I get to observe and measure, and then they stop. They can't remember. And it's funny because they apply this scientific method every day. Each step of the scientific method is the same, but each patient they see is unique. However, when they see a patient, the approach is similar. One, they take a history, they do a physical exam, they run diagnostic tests, develop a differential, initiate the appropriate treatment, and then manage and optimize their treatment plan by rerunning that same process over and over again. Obviously, there's a lot of detail behind each step, and all of their training and residency, medical school fellowship, and practice experience goes into that. And although each step of the process is different for each patient or each experiment, if you will, in the scientific method, the overall approach is consistent. And the next slide really kind of shows that very well. So there again, you have the scientific method. And if you look at the physician methodology, it lines right up. If you look at Six Sigma methodology, the Deming cycle, Baldrige, or almost any other process improvement or performance improvement methodology, it lines right up with the scientific method, which never changes. And that makes, when you show it to physicians this way and other clinicians, it makes a lot more sense. There used to be a time where physicians would say, PI is not a science, and so it cannot be applied to clinical practice. We are way past that now, and PI, most of the approaches are scientifically based and absolutely can be applied to care variation reduction initiatives. So what is physician engagement not? We're not telling them how to practice medicine. It's not cookie cutter medicine. We're not only calling them when there's a problem. You can read these yourself down the line. Giving them limited or wrong data or information can be very destructive to the process. The idea, no matter how charming you are and smart you are, is not to bend them to your will solely for your own purposes. The point of a hospital is to, number one, treat patients, and number two, improve the way we treat patients. And that's really what you're trying to do. Playing games like pitting them against one another or taking credit for their work or results is also an extremely bad idea. And if you've ever tried that, I'm sure you have a couple of scars to show for it. So this is what we mean by transparency and integrity. And that kind of honesty and trust building is extremely important to care variation reduction initiatives. So how can we support it? Okay, sponsoring them with leadership opportunities, providing opportunities for them to work on committees, involvement in decision-making, and providing training in those basic non-clinical skills. They should have appropriate accommodation and structures for decision-making. And again, providing recognitions, incentives, and support, whether it's pay or something else, has a lot of value to them. Instead of paying them, maybe it's worth it to say, hey, doc, you did a great job on that improvement initiative, and we are going to, for instance, ACHE next year. Would you please come and present your work at ACHE? That rings, that goes very well often with physicians because they're used to presenting their good work at conferences. And so this is another opportunity for them to do that outside of solely having a clinical focus, but really moving into that executive area. So unengaged physicians. And here you can see the Martini glass here, because often dealing with unengaged physicians means that you need a martini, hopefully after you try to engage them, not before. But first you need to understand why they're unengaged. Is it just a lack of understanding, a lack of interest? Are they new to your system? Or are they intentionally resisting what you're trying to do? And in a group of the former, that they may lack an understanding or they may be new, that's an opportunity. For the intentional resistors, you'll really need to start to listen to what they're saying, to understand what their concerns are, and seeking a human connection with them. I often know more about the intentional resistors on any project than I do about the physicians who are already engaged and doing very well. If I know the names of their children and they know the names of my children, that tends to build trust, because often they could see you as just a suit coming in to tell them how to practice medicine. And that's really not what you're trying to do. In doing care variation reduction, what you're really doing is advocating for the physicians and for clinical practice excellence. And most importantly, you're advocating for their patients. Now, most physicians feel like they are tireless patient advocates, and that is true. But sometimes they may not be aware of the very best way to advocate for their patients. And embarking upon a care variation reduction initiative is certainly a way to advocate for patients. You need to support their practice as well. If they have challenges, if they have barriers, that's part of the transactional nature of the relationship you were trying to address with them. And of course, helping them to network not only with each other, there are other physicians who can guide them in clinical decision making, but also the resources that will be needed to create the operational change at the bedside is very important. You need to surround them with trustworthy, transparent resources that can help them move forward. And of course, again, recognize and reward them whenever you can. So let's review. What exactly is engagement? We know that you can't buy it. If you break your promises or you waste their time, you can injure the level of engagement. We know that it needs support from an organization-wide strategy, and critically, it needs support from the operational elements that will help the physicians leverage their clinical expertise. So in thinking about physician engagement for the purposes of care variation reduction, and how mature is my organization in terms of physician engagement, these are questions to consider for yourself. Do most of the physicians in my organization have an official role? Are physicians coming to me and requesting PI initiatives? And are they familiar with our PI methodology? Are they coming to meetings of their own accord, not necessarily compulsory, making them compulsory, but are they coming because they're interested and they share your belief that your effort is worthwhile for them and for their patients? There needs to be frank discussions of challenges, forgetting any kind of political considerations you have. And that's why, as Laurie mentioned, leadership needs to be involved from the very top. And there are a number of other ones here. Let me just say one more thing in terms of data, because data is very central to helping physicians move forward on their clinical practice and reducing the variation in clinical care. What you don't want to present physicians with is simply data. You need to help translate that data to information for them. And when we work with clinical intelligence, one of the tools they use to be able to do that are those storyboards. And those storyboards are a direct translation of the data that you have in your systems that allow physicians to put that data into context and turn it into information. So you've gone through the vetting and validation with the physicians, but the way that you display that data in those meetings where they're reviewing it and making operational decisions about how they are going to change, the way it's presented is very important. I have seen a number of healthcare systems, including the ones that I have worked at, invest in building up their own data resources. It's tough to do that. You need a lot of people who have spent many years working on how do you tell and translate this data to information for physicians. And so considering an outside source to help you with that is probably the way to go, at least at first, and certainly if you haven't done something like this before. And with that, Laurie, I will turn it over to you. And thanks so much for having me as a guest.
Absolutely. Dr. Doug Monroe. I think this next process step, Doug, What we'll do is we'll share some examples of some storyboards, but I think it'd be really insightful if you can give your insight from a physician perspective and a performance improvement system level expert. Why don't we go through some examples and leave these behind with the audience, and feel free to interject, okay? So you've talked a lot about building engagement and trust and a culture of transparency. Um, we're going to share some examples of some of those different reports during the assessment phase, during the implementation phase, and also the sustainability phase. One of the areas that we think is really important to create some context for the data is to provide trends of the key performance indicators so we can see over time what's changing, what's improving, what's not improving, and presenting the data in context over time, typically 2 to 3 years, will give us an understanding of maybe the change. It gives us perspective. So what are your thoughts as far as trending the KPIs, Doug?
Always extremely important. And I do have a good story where a CMO in the Southeast was presenting data to the board and would only present a snapshot of the last 3 months. And it was very difficult for the board and the physicians to understand the progress they had made because the sample size was limited. And you can also see there that you've got, trend lines, not just the data itself, but you're trending the data there. That is extremely important to be able to gauge how much progress you are making versus your goal. And you're absolutely right. Taking a time frame that is a large enough sample size really allows you to see how much variation is left and how far you've come in your efforts.
So we talk about data and how it's important can accelerate time to value. And you've talked about the importance of making sure that we're not sharing data for the sake of data to physicians, that we translate that and we create actionable, insightful data that's meaningful. Um, this is just an example of some of those type of data um, that we've talked about. Comparators, we've talked about making sure that we're providing them trend lines. And when we drill into the data, it's so important to be able to really kind of have that drillability, because oftentimes physicians will want to know what's behind the data, not just the providing summary statistics, but can we drill down to the patient level? Can we drill down to the physician level? How important is that, Dr. Monroe, to be able to drill into the data versus providing summary statistics in a flat file?
Well, I think providing summary statistics is appropriate many times when you're dealing with leadership or board members. But if you've got a clinical consensus team sitting around and trying to make decisions about what do I need to change at the ground level in order to improve these metrics, being able to drill down to the patient level is extremely important. And it allows them to see exactly what's going on with each patient, and also allows them to say, when I look at this data, now I remember. Here's exactly what happened with this patient. And of course, the next question becomes, well, how do we prevent that from happening again? So being able to drill down to the patient level is indispensable for operational and care variation reduction initiatives.
Mhm. So when we identify a focus project for the clinical variation reduction program, oftentimes we look at drilling down into the various cohorts, clinical cohorts, such as sepsis and small and large bowel procedures, for example. But we also drill that down into the various revenue cycles or revenue centers or cost centers, such as what are the expenses around your supplies or pharmacy? What's the utilization of your MRIs, or how many CBCs are we ordering on a daily basis? So it's important to look at that vertical and horizontal approach when we study clinical variation. So here's an example, just an example of a financial summary that allows us to see the volume, the 16,000, and we're looking at a inpatient cohort for a time period here. And we're able to compare the various service lines contribution margin on that bubble chart. So on the right side is the bubble chart, and we look at what service lines are contributing the margin to our enterprise. And we can start with that high level, just really macro, and then start to ask questions. Good data really does um, cause physicians to ask questions. I mean, that's the best type of data, is when you can get the physicians engaged to say, well, let's drill down, let's find out why. So when we drill that down and we study the variation, we are looking at the practice patterns and comparing those practice patterns to other physicians or best practices. So that we talked about the different methods of studying and quantifying variation, looking at that variation above the mean, looking at the variation below the mean, and establishing some goals around that. This is an example of a septicemia storyboard, and it really embraces the metrics around clinical, quality, and financial. So it incorporates those three variation methodologies, where we translate that into the dollars. It includes trends around the performance around the last 2 years, and it also allows for drillability and even exclusions of outliers, and the ability to trim the data and to segment the data by severity of illness and risk of mortality. It's so important to be able to do that, because if you're not going to risk adjust the data and you don't trim the data, then I think what we're going to be left with is a very mixed population. So it's really important to before you begin the study of clinical variation, to try to establish the most homogeneous population that is possible. So that's a real strong takeaway, is to make sure that the data needs to be presented in such a way that it's meaningful. We certainly don't want to share data with a physician that's a blend of it's a DRG, and it's a blend of all the total joint replacements, of knee and hip, and they've got revisions in there, and they've got complex patients in there, and we're comparing apples and oranges. So it's really important to make sure your data is homogeneous. This is an example of a utilization storyboard, and this is a knee joint replacement. And this storyboard can be printed on an 11 by 17 placemat. It's very large. It's integrating different data elements into the report, including your potential savings opportunity, those three different methodologies. You can see that 504,000 up to 1.3 million. That's the measure of direct cost savings with decreasing variation. And then it drills down the data into different segments. Here you're seeing on the left side on that heat chart, you see the drivers of the cost. So the key driver in this example are implants for knee replacement, then the operating room, and then room and board. And then we get into sterile supplies. So you can kind of see the context there. You can drill into those box and whiskers and look at that variation and the median and the min and the max. A lot of information in this storyboard. On the right side of the storyboard, you can see the distribution of the providers, the surgeons, and the components of those cost drivers. So you can easily, the data actually speaks to you. And the key questions are, well, what's going on with that, the surgeon in the large bar? Well, what's driving that? And then also presenting the variation curves around different process metrics within that cohort is really important. So this is a pretty busy slide, but when it's insightful, informative, that's really the key takeaway. Also, it's important to be transparent with the physicians. It's okay to share operational P&Ls. It's okay to share the the financials. Many executive leaders are now feeling more comfortable and sharing and trust. That's really how you build trust. Don't hide your financials from physicians. It gives them the insight that they need. They can really help improve that book of financial business as along with quality. And when presenting the variation curves, I think this is really key. Um, Dr. Monroe talked about how do you present data to a physician. So Dr. Monroe, these are data and for knee replacements, about 1,400 cases, and this is real data. And this is Dr. Smith here, and you're meeting with Dr. Smith. How would you go about sharing the data with Dr. Smith in this example?
Well, I think it's important to say first to Dr. Smith that this data has been fully and thoroughly vetted by his peers and himself or herself. And so at this point now, we know that the data is absolutely real. But when you look at these knee replacements, we're also going to say that we've risk adjusted all of this data so that we are comparing apples to apples. And when we do that, we see that the average direct cost per case of your data, Dr. Smith, is way above what the other physicians have. We had this situation once with a client who had a lot of surgeons who had picked their own or had picked their own vendors for the tools they were using and the surgical instruments they were using during the operations. And it dawned on one physician looking at this data that the vendor had given him a much worse price than the other physicians in the room. And I have to tell you, in terms of renegotiating with the vendor, leveraging that physician to be on the phone while that physician called the vendor themselves and said, "Why are you charging me more than the other physicians?" was extremely effective and really changed that cost almost immediately. It's not safe to assume when you look at this data that all of the cost is caused by a variation in the way the physician is doing things. Sometimes they're unaware of the costs associated with the provision of care. So as you said, Laurie, being transparent about this data and explaining that to the physician can often lead them to make the decisions you want them to make anyway on their own. And many times they're much more passionate about the variation than even we would be.
Excellent. So then we work with Dr. Smith and we work with him to drill into the different components of the data and really start to kind of show Dr. Smith where that variation is occurring. And it turns out that that variation was in the cost of the tibial base plate, as you had indicated. So we work with supply chain and we work with the physician, and it's nothing that the physician did wrong. It's just that those costs of those supplies were so different than his peer group. All right, this is another example of a storyboard. Now it's getting into the provider patterns and sharing transparently the different practice patterns of the different surgeons. Again, we have knee replacement. We have 200 cases in this example, 11 million in charges. We've got 3 million in payments, about $11,700 per case. So again, we're looking at the average direct cost per surgeon, and we see the variation. So Doug, can you interpret this bubble chart for the group?
Sure. So obviously there are some surgeons there, and they seem to be your relatively, especially surgeon one, your higher volume surgeon. But we also see that your higher volume surgeon has a higher average direct cost. So in terms of identifying where the additional cost is coming from, it's very easy to talk to the surgeons about, look, surgeon one, you've got a very high volume, the highest volume, but your average direct cost per case is higher than your peers, where can we identify things that you are doing differently to decrease the cost and bring you towards the left side of the chart here while keeping your volume the same?
Mhm. And so bubble charts are so powerful because we can look at three variables: your X, your Y, and your size of that bubble gives you that third variable. So if you're not leveraging bubble charts, start to do so because it's extremely insightful. Now we drill into that same cohort, the total knee of those 200 cases, and we can begin to understand where the variation exists. So surgeon 1, 2, 3, and note that surgeon 3, we talked about the implant was almost twice as expensive as the peer group. So we can kind of isolate and identify some key questions, and of course we would validate this with the invoices and really start to really form some discussion around what is the best practice. Can we look at the different implants and start to standardize our products? So those are some examples. We want to leave you with a reflection on your entire clinical variation program and your readiness of this exciting program around your vision, your governance, your leadership, your charters. Are they in place? Are all your people in place? Are we doing this for the right reasons? So there's the structural people component, the process. Do we have the right fit analytics? Can we drill down? Is our costing data in place? Are we using an RCC methodology where it's high level? Or are we using an activity-based costing where we can feel confident with high confidence in the direction of that data as far as the direct cost? And then finally, outcomes. Are we realizing measurable, sustainable outcomes and rewarding those improved outcomes for patient care and provider? And so think about that overcoming the challenges for your program and understanding why clinical variation study can help an organization create sustainable outcomes with the right roadmap for change, embedded with a strong PI systematic approach, how it's critical to leverage clinical consensus teams to develop the evidence-based work plans that actually hardwire the best practices in the organization to decrease the variation, and the critical component of engaging physicians and empowering physicians to lead, again, with the right fit analytics helping to drive the time to value for continuous improvement. So we want to thank you so much for attending this webinar on clinical variation. And Doug, did you have any closing remarks?
No, I just wanted to thank you for involving me here. And, if people need to look at physician engagement and clinician engagement, just remember, we often talk about physician engagement, mostly because most of the other clinicians in the hospital are traditionally far more engaged in this kind of work than physicians. So we use the terms interchangeably, but we know that physicians are a good target because of the history of our healthcare system.
All right, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sandy. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you, Laurie, Jaccard, Dr. Doug Monroe, and Clinical Intelligence for sharing how hospitals and care delivery networks can address unwarranted clinical variation and how they might get started on a CVR strategy to drive value in their organizations. If you have any questions for Laurie Jaccard or Dr. Doug Monroe, or if you'd like to schedule a discovery call to learn more, please reach out to Robin Furlong, sales consultant with Clinical Intelligence, and she'll be happy to make those connections. Thank you so much for joining us today.